The James Blish Books. This is episode 11.
You're listening to 70s Trek with Bob Turner and Kelly Casto, the fan podcast that looks at Star Trek in the 1970s. It was the decade that built a franchise.
Well, I hope you have your reading glasses handy because this week we're talking about books.
Specifically, the Star Trek books written by author James Blish. Bob, did you read any of these?
I did, yes. I collected them all as a kid and in the early 70s when there wasn't much Trek out there. These things were gold.
Well, yeah, and I think any kid who was a Star Trek fan growing up in the 70s, had to go grab those and just devour them. So I'm really looking forward that we're talking about Mr. Blish this week.
Yeah, me too. But first, why don't we tell our listeners how they can reach us? You can head on over to our Facebook page. You can find it at facebook.com/70s Trek. And feel free to leave us a question or a comment. We'd love to hear from you.
And you can also find us on iTunes. So just search for 70s Trek. Subscribe, leave a rating, a review. This will help us. So please do it.
Who is James Blish? Kelly, I got to tell you, as a kid in the 70s, I was dying to know who this guy was. I mean, come on. What a great job he had writing Star Trek episodes.
I know. And why wasn't anybody else writing them then?
Yeah, right. I thought he had the coolest job ever.
I think he did, too.
But, Kelly, you actually looked into James Blish and to see who the man was. Why don't you tell us a little bit about him?
I can do that. So, James Benjamin Blish, he was born East Orange, New Jersey, May 23rd, 1921. As we know, he's an author, did fantasy, science fiction. He wrote literary criticism of other science fiction works. So in the 30s and 40s, he really got into the science fiction and the fantasy genre as a member of the then well-known New York fan group, the Futurians.
Oh, I love the Futurians. Wasn't that on Fridays at 8?
It was. And then maybe not. Okay.
Oh, okay, sorry.
So, but that's where he really started to, hone his skills. And there he became friends with other, up-and-coming writers, but really became friends with some of the most influential and pioneers of science fiction. People like Damon Knight, C.M. Kornbluth. There were others. But this is where he really started to hone his craft. He went to Rutgers and Columbia University studying biology. And that led him into the big war, World War II, where he was a medical technician in the Army. So after the war, he went on to be a science editor at Pfizer Pharmaceutical Companies.
Really?
Yeah.
So wait a minute. He studies and learns from all these classic sci-fi authors, and then he goes and sells drugs?
Pretty much.
Okay.
So, obviously that helps him with his writing skills, further hones them. He starts publishing in the 40s, though. And, while he's, going to college or and also, working at Pfizer. And, his career just kept progressing and progressing. So he just decided to become a professional writer. So some of the things he was credited with as a writer, he coined the term gas giant.
Really?
Yes, and this was a story that he wrote that was in an anthology. Um, the story was called Solar Plexus. It was in an anthology, Beyond Human Ken, the 21 startling stories of science fiction and fantasy. But he wrote this story even before that, and like 1941.
That's amazing.
So yeah. So the other thing that one of the things he's also credited with early on, and he's got the background of biology. Well, nobody really was writing about biological terms and into the science fiction genre. It was mainly like physics, chemistry, that kind of thing. So he was one of the pioneers that actually threw in the biological themes into his stories. And one such story with a seedling star in 1957. So that was one of his most notable ones, with that biological theme.
So he was a bit of a trendsetter, I guess you could say.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. He also, obviously accomplished writer. He won a Hugo for best novel called Case of Conscience. And he won several, or was up for several awards over his career. But that was one that just kind of stuck out, 1959 when he won that award. The theme here really was a priest dealt with inhabitants of a planet that really didn't have the concept of original sin.
Really?
Yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting.
So what? It's just a wild party all the time?
I guess.
Okay, what time does the space flight leave, and what platform do I need to be on?
This is a family show, so I'll just keep.
Yeah, right.
I'll just move on.
That's right.
So he also, now this is before he started writing the books, Star Trek books. He went and worked at the Tobacco Institute.
Wait a minute. Okay, so he's studying with these great sci-fi authors, writing sci-fi books. He's a trendsetter, and he's working for the Tobacco Institute?
Yeah, we got to make money, a steady paycheck.
Is that what was going on with Pfizer and the Tobacco Institute? That was okay.
Yeah.
Well,
so
nobody said writing was easy, huh?
Well, right. Love for your craft does not necessarily pay you for your craft,
or put food in your belly.
Exactly. And I thought that was kind of interesting. The Tobacco Institute. I looked into that a little bit, and it's crazy. It was all about selling tobacco, right? It's making it look like it was not evil.
That's interesting. Well, and he was an avid smoker.
Yes, and yeah, we'll get to that, but he eventually probably died from that. So that was in the 62, 68 range. But in 1967 is when he started writing the Star Trek books. And he during that time, 67 to 75, he wrote 11 volumes, short stories, basically adaptations from the episodes. The original series. So he took all of the episodes, wrote them into basically short stories in those 11 volumes. He didn't put in 2 of them, the episodes. And that was the I, Mud and Mud's Woman. He wanted to make that its own novel called Mud's Angels.
Right. He was trying to meld those 2 stories together, wasn't he?
Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, he died before he could get to that. So his then wife, his second wife, Judith Lawrence, she completed that Star Trek 12th novel or book. And he also wrote an original novel. Did you read that one, Bob?
I actually did. And I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. Yeah.
All right. So I'll leave that for you to tell.
Ooh, cool.
But sadly, James, in 75, he died of lung cancer.
He was working for the Tobacco Institute.
Yeah, all the smoke you want.
Yeah, I think that's right. So you mentioned that in 1967, he began writing. Bantam Books acquired the rights to do adaptations of the Star Trek episodes. And they approached Mr. Blish, again, kind of a noted, well-known author, award winner. And they said, hey, we'd like to give you an exclusive contract. And at first he wasn't sure he wanted to do it. He hadn't seen Star Trek. And he thought it would be some kiddie show. He wasn't sure that this was a great idea. But then there's the money thing, and so he decided to do it. So early on in Star Trek's 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 in those books, he wasn't getting shooting scripts. It wasn't like he was on conference calls with Roddenberry and they were telling him what to write and how to write these stories. Early on, production assistants were just sending him stuff. Just send him stuff about this show and then send him stuff about this show. So he was getting very early drafts of scripts. In some cases, he was just getting the early story treatments and having to write the adaptations around those. So what was happening was the stuff that showed up in the books was very different from what aired. And in fact, because these were early stories, sometimes things didn't make sense to him. Yeah, you got to remember, this is a very well-known, very noted science fiction author. And so sci-fi authors, what do? They connect dots and they make sure that it works scientifically. Some of these concepts to Blish didn't make sense. And so he, on his own, would explain the science or create the science or create the explanation so it was plausible. And for the reader, it was like gold, man. You were getting stuff that they never even talked about in the episode. Cool stuff. It's what made the books very special to me because it wasn't just a rehash of the script in paperback form. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There was more to it.
So, and I never put the dots together, but most of the episodes start with you're on the bridge or something like that, where he hardly ever did that.
Right. He would, because sometimes he just had treatments or because he had early shooting scripts, right, he would start the stories differently. And he used the captain's log, but that sort of came later. The earlier stuff, he didn't use it as much. And just to give you an idea of how this the early treatments and such were what he was receiving, in Star Trek 1, he's got a story called Charlie's Law, which was supposed to be Charlie X, rather.
Yeah.
And then in a later book, I think it's Star Trek 3, he has a story called The Last Gunfight, which is supposed to be Spectre of the Gun. And these inconsistencies drove Gene Roddenberry crazy. He hated it. He hated the fact that there were these inconsistencies, that Blish was deviating from the scripts, that he was inventing stuff, and he would refer to the Blish books as the damn books. And it was always, we have to do something about the damn books. At one point, all of this sort of forced Roddenberry to lay down a policy that just said, hey, look, you know what? These guys who are licensees, just make sure they only get finished scripts after an episode's been filmed. We need to stop all this stuff, all this inconsistency stuff. But as I said, the fact that Blish was out there sort of writing these from, let's call it a sketch, it really brought uniqueness to the adaptations. They were fresh. They were different. It was the story that you had watched, but it was like it had 2 or 3 more layers underneath of it. And you were hearing the inner monologue from some of the characters sometimes, or you were getting explanation that the Star Trek episode that aired could never give you. So it really made it cool. It really added more to it. And I think it's what makes those books stand out. At one point, Blish was interviewed in the early 70s, and he was talking about the books, and he said, I enjoyed the work more than I expected to. Some of it was actually fun, such as contriving explanations for situations which couldn't have been shown in the dramatized form. But when I finished the first book, I had almost decided not to do another. Then the fan mail began to come in.
Uh-huh.
And he goes on to say, and it has kept on coming in. And this was interview around 73. It kept on coming in, averaging 3 letters a day over nearly 5 years. And I've received more letters about Star Trek books than I have about the entire body of my original work, despite the fact that almost all of my other books are still in print. So right away, he began to see that, wow, there's a hunger out there for this stuff. Well, how much of a hunger? You know, how much of an audience was there? Well, there were 12 books in all. Each contained about 5 to 7 adaptations of the episodes. And the episodes or the stories that appear in the Blish books, they're out of broadcast order. So just to give you an idea how successful these stories were, the average sci-fi book in the 70s sold about 40,000 copies. Some of the Blish books were selling 400,000 copies.
Wow.
And in 1975, at that point, there were only 11 books. Those 11 books had reached 4 million in sales. I mean, that's pretty staggering. So the release order, just to kind of run this down here real quick. Star Trek 1 came out in 67. Star Trek 2 in 68. 3 in 69. 4 in 71. Star Trek 5 in 72. 6 was in 72. 7 was in 72. And 8 was in 72. He had a heck of a year.
Holy mackerel.
Yeah. Star Trek 9 came out in 1973. 10 came out in 73. 11 came out in 74. And then, of course, we know what happened. Mr. Blish died of lung cancer in 1975, and his wife, Judith, went to work and finished Star Trek 12 in 1977. Now, the fact that she jumped in and finished Star Trek 12 in 1977, it's been believed that that's the only book she really worked on. That's not the case. Actually, she started working on the books around Star Trek 7 or 8 in 1972. Blish had been diagnosed with cancer and wanted to do some original work, not just the Star Trek work. So he kind of refocused his efforts and started working on original work that he wanted to get published before he died. He knew he was dying. And Judith jumped in, and she wrote 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and then later on 12. And to help her, Judith had her mother working on some of the stories. Her mother was a romance novelist. So she jumped in and worked on these books as well. I thought that was pretty interesting story. Yeah. In 1970, James Blish published Spock Must Die. It's not the first Star Trek book published. It's the second, but it's the first novel written for adults. And it's a sequel to the episode Errand of Mercy. Did you ever read it?
I didn't read that one.
Oh, my God. I can remember when this came out as a kid going, huh, it's new Star Trek. It's new. Oh, my God. Blish at that moment became an instant hero in my 10-year-old eyes. Well, I think I was 10 when I first came across it. So the book is, like I said, very much a sequel to Errand of Mercy. The Klingons declare war, and they are holding the Organians captive. And Kirk needs to send Spock to Organia to discover what's going on. You know, if you remember, the Organian peace treaty was keeping the Klingons and the Federation from fighting. Well, now the Klingons are attacking, and the Federation is saying, whoa, what gives? Where are the Organians at? So in order to send Spock, Scotty creates this souped-up transporter that uses tachyons. Kind of cool. That's the first time I'd ever heard of tachyons. And in fact, that was Blish sort of using a new discovery. Tachyon is a particle that travels faster than the speed of light. And he used it to describe this new transporter effect. So using this new transporter creates a duplicate Spock. Yeah. The duplicate Spock is much like the duplicate Kirk that was created. He's a bad guy. So that's where the book starts to take off. Spock ends up working for the Klingons, the bad Spock, a duplicate Spock. And they find out much too late. And, of course, that guy's got to go. Hence the title, Spock Must Die. Pretty radical idea in 1970. And, of course, this is 12 years before The Wrath of Khan. But to even throw that in a title, a main character must die, kind of a big idea. The book also stood out because most of the books or the episodes from the original series, as we wrapped up the story, the Star Trek universe was sort of back to where it was when the episode started. So, in other words, you could pick up each episode or each story and nothing really changed. This was different in this book. It did not reset the Star Trek universe. Things were changed at the end of this book. The intention was that Blish wanted to write more original Star Trek novels, and he wanted to pick up the threads where Spock Must Die left off, but he wasn't able to get to it. And in fact, there would not be another original novel until 1976 with Spock Messiah. But that's kind of the story of Spock Must Die. Kind of interesting.
Yeah. So with the Spock Messiah book, did they start to introduce continuity with the TV shows back then? Or because, obviously Spock Must Die kind of took a left turn on continuity.
Right. Yeah, no, the books that came from Bantam later on in the 70s were very much like episodes. You would dive in and have an adventure. The adventure would get wrapped up and concluded, and then everything was the way it was before the story started. Much like every week adventure.
Right.
Blish commented at one point that the Star Trek books had made more money for him than any other work he had ever done throughout his life. They had been that popular. He commented in, I think, 1973, the conclusions seemed escapable to me that Star Trek had opened up a whole new audience, mostly very young, for science fiction. And it was a far larger audience than any of the genre had ever had before. So that was Blish commenting on, wow, Star Trek is pretty huge. There's one other piece of this that I thought I just would bring up real quick, and it's not related to James Blish, but it's related to the cover art on these books. The cover art is amazing on some of these. Yes.
I always thought that.
I always did too. And one artist in particular really sort of caught my imagination as a kid. As an adult, I went and did some research on him. His name is Lou Feck. And in the 70s, he was really prodigious, a real versatile illustrator. He did the covers for Star Trek IV, Star Trek VI, and Star Trek VIII. And they are striking. And if you Google those and look at the Google images, you'll see those. In fact, those three images were used on later compilation books, the Star Trek Reader and others. I really think because that art is so good. Fellow artist Vincent DeFate said he was also producing some of the most striking cover illustrations the paperback field had ever seen. That's how much he thought of Lou Feck. Unfortunately, he struck hot in the 70s, but died in 1981 of a heart attack at the age of 56. So young. But if you Google those illustrations, those covers of those particular Star Trek books, 4, 6, and 8, I think you'll see what I'm saying. They're really good. They're almost haunting. They're almost haunting in their effect. I wish right now it was a visual medium, but it's not.
It'd be nice to get those like mounted or, in a picture or a bigger picture, like, I don't know.
I agree. I'd love to have the one from Star Trek 4. It's probably one of my favorite pieces of Star Trek art. And it goes back for me as a kid. I can remember getting that book and just staring at it. It's a picture of the Enterprise over what looks like a moon. And then up in the upper right corner is a blue sun. And It just has this haunting look to it. The Enterprise is out there all by itself. It almost looks kind of lonely in the image. Very, very cool, though. I would love to have a big print of that someday. That's really cool stuff.
I always thought it was kind of hokey that Star Trek 1, 2, 3, 4, come on, give it a title. But the art, screw the title, the art was just fantastic.
Yeah, and effects art on 6, I think it's Spock and a couple other crewmen are in mid transporter effect. They're transparent as they're beaming away from a alien world. And then Star Trek 8, it's got a red hue, and there's an unnamed officer there getting ready to be beamed up. It looks like he's on a communicator. And in the distance, which is really cool, in the distance, you see the Enterprise streaking overhead. Yes. Really, really cool.
That's the ones I remember distinctly.
Yep. Because you can it just conveys that sense of awe and mystery. Cool stuff.
Definitely.
The Blish books were very cool. So we're hoping you have some memories about the James Blish books. And if so, hey, tell us what they are. Leave us a comment or even a question at our Facebook page. It's facebook.com/70strek. And don't forget, you can find this show on iTunes. Just search 70s Trek there. We're there. Aren't we there?
We're there.
We're there.
Yeah, what are we doing next week?
Hey, next week we're going to look at Gene Roddenberry's career after Star Trek.
Thanks for listening to 70s Trek, an independent fan production. Join us next week as we explore more about the production, the actors, the producers, and the influencers of Star Trek in the lost decade of the 1970s on 70s Trek.